Okay, so in the last lecture we started talking about divine command theory. And in this lecture I just want to finish up talking about divine command theory. I want to say a bit about why divine command theory turns out to be problematic. Even in most religious traditions, divine command theory has not been the main way to think about morality. It's been there in some, but it's not been the main way. You know, Something like natural law theory has usually been more influential, and we'll say a bit about why. Um, so what then is the problem with divine command theory? Remember, divine command theory says, well, right and wrong are just functions of God's commands. To say something is right means God commands it. To say something is wrong means God forbids it, right? Moral rules come down to what God commands. Well, the problem with divine command theory, the big problem, is what's called the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro dilemma comes from a dialogue by Plato that I'm not having you guys read. It's good, it's interesting, it's a little confusing. I think we can get to the issues a little more directly. So in the Euthyphro, Socrates, the main character, he runs into this guy Euthyphro, and Euthyphro claims that he has this great knowledge of morality because he knows what the gods want. This was ancient Greece, so it wasn't God. It was, a set of gods. But, same basic idea. Euthyphro claims that the right thing to do is what the gods command. He goes for some form of divine command theory. And so Socrates pushes him and he says, well, okay, this idea that you're putting forward, moral rules are commands of God, what does it mean? And Socrates pushes him and he says, well, it seems like it might mean two things. Possible to mean, one of two different things. So option one says certain actions are right or wrong only because God commands them. What is it for an action to be right or wrong? God commands or forbids it, right? Option two says, well, God commands or forbids these things because they are wrong or right independently of those commands. He knows that they're right or wrong, and that's why he chooses to command what he does. Option one, on the other hand, says, well, there's nothing more to something being right or wrong than God commanding it or forbidding it. So I think an example will make this clear. So option one, murder is wrong only because God has chosen to forbid murder. God has commanded us not to commit murder. Nothing more to be said about on option one, what's wrong with murder, than God commands that we not do it. Option two, on the other hand, would say, well, there's some independent fact, some explanation of why murder is wrong. You can explain why that is independent of what God has commanded, and that fact that it's wrong, that explains why God commands us not to commit murder. Okay. So hopefully you guys understand the two options. Well, option one is, I think, you can be a divine command theorist and take either option, but really in the purest form, properly speaking divine command theory, I think you really have to take option one. And option one has some really serious problems. They're pretty closely related. And one problem is that it seems arbitrary. The command not to murder, or the command not to steal, or the command not to do whatever, if all you can say about it is, well, God says not to do it, that seems arbitrary, right? And that seems to set up a problem. The problem seems to be, well, What if God commanded us to do something awful? What if God suddenly said, murder isn't just, you know, it isn't just that murder is no longer forbidden, murder's a great thing, go murder as many people as you can. Would murder suddenly be the right thing to do? Or some other awful action like rape? Currently, God forbids it, but what if it was commanded? Would it suddenly be the morally right thing to do? Now, of course, any believer is going to say, well, that's ridiculous. God wouldn't command those things, right? But this gets to why, divine command theory, at least in the purest form, hasn't been that popular in most religious traditions. Well, the problem is you really can't make any claims about what God would or wouldn't command if you take option one, right? Well, why is that? Well, to talk about God's goodness, to say, well, God wouldn't do this because he's good, you need some kind of language, independent language of goodness. Well, option one doesn't let you have that. For something to be good or bad, all it is that God commands it or forbids it, right? So, if all there is about something being good is that God commands it, well, you can't really say that God wouldn't command it because it would be bad or it wouldn't be good. All that it means to talk about goodness is to talk about God commanding it. So, option one, it's arbitrary, and it doesn't even give us a language that allows us to talk about God's goodness, right? You need to make goodness, to do that, you need to make goodness in some way independent of commanding. Well, what about option two? I'm not going to go deeply into this. Option two would say there's some independent standard, there's some independent explanation, for why God commands what he does. God commands us not to murder because God is good and perfectly loving, and he knows murder does all this harm to other people, right? Might give an explanation like that, might give some other explanation. And option two would say, well, there's an independent fact, independent explanation for why God commands what he does, but maybe we know what's right and wrong primarily through God's commands, right? Well, look, even option two is still problematic for reasons that your reading points out. So just talking about God's commands don't seem to be a sufficient guide to morality, right? Well, why not? Well, think about what's going to happen if I try to base a moral claim on God's supposed commands, right? Even if we are both religious people, there is a very good chance you are going to disagree with me. I might be a Christian, you might be a Muslim. I might say something about God's commands and you're like, no, you're just wrong. But even if we're members of roughly the same religion, well, there's still the need to interpret God's commands, right? You and I might both be Christians. We might agree on what God's commands are. You might interpret them in entirely different ways. Even, there's plenty of different denominations of Christianity, plenty of different groupings of Islam and Judaism. But even if we're in the same group, two Catholics might not agree, right? Happens all the time. They disagree on what the commands of God means. So the basic thought here is, the second I bring in God's commands, I am going to be making extremely controversial claims. And remember, when we make a moral argument, we want it to start with non-controversial claims. We want it to start with claims the other person will accept, or that we think it likely they will accept. When we base our claims on God's commands, well, there's a very good chance the other person will not agree with us, that our claims will be very controversial. So if we're looking for a framework where we can argue and discuss with other people who might disagree with us, bringing in God's commands is not going to be a good route to do that. All right. So that's why divine command theory seems like not a great approach to morality. You know, in some forms it seems completely arbitrary, but even if we make some moves to make it seem less arbitrary, it seems like it's going to base morality, base ethics and claims other people very well might disagree with. Hopefully that makes sense. So for those reasons, I'm going to put divine command theory aside and begin talking about natural law theory. Natural law theory tries to address these problems with divine command theory. Does it do so? Well, let's see.